My name is Amin, and I'm the clinical exercise physiologist here for MS and Parkinson's Canterbury, and welcome all of you to another keynote speaker series that we have here. Before I go ahead, I will just make sure I cover some points here for phones. So, can we just take the time, make sure that our phone is on silent, or just simply turn it off. If you're new to the building, you can see the one exit door over that side on your left. There's one by the cafe and one where we came in. So if anything happens, just keep calm. Follow the instruction when we meet you at the front by the bike rack. Again, if you want to use the bathroom, and if you are a first class person, we have 2 first class toilets by the corridor where the gym is. And otherwise, if you are an economy person, right in front of you when you open the door. When you're opening the door, please make sure you do open the standard door, not the slidey one, because it's quite noisy, so try to avoid that. I think I've covered all of those. MS and Parkinson, as you know, moved from a charitable trust, moved from a society to a charitable trust. So in the past, meaning that people need to pay annual fee and subscription. So over the last 2 years, we changed the approach, and it's been really fantastic, opening the doors to everyone. And obviously, moving to this new, beautiful, amazing building, give us the opportunity to provide the support that people need. So the majority of our support coming from you guys and from the donation and support from each member. So please do make sure, go to our website and hit the donation button and donate, or you could do it today, use the donation bucket at the back. I think Linda will bring it in, or you could do it on at the reception. So every small help will count for us. To be able to have these sessions, have our free services, have the consultation that you come and see me, see the health and wellbeing advisors, which is all covering those costs. Fantastic. So today, as you know, there's a question series, Ask Me Question series. So you have the chance to submit your questions before you come. So Professor Anderson is accepted to answer majority of them. And if you don't submit your question, you didn't get a chance to do it, no stress. At the end, if you have time, we'll open the floor for some questions. But please do consider that we are not discussing individual treatment or, all of those individual questions. Is going to be general question around Parkinson's. Fantastic. We are really delighted to have you, Professor Anderson, here today, and thank you for your time. I think we are so lucky in Canterbury, and I can proudly say that, to have someone like him here. It's not easy to work as a neurologist, as a movement disorder specialist in university, and working as a researcher. It's quite a big value for Canterbury and New Zealand. So, and I had the chance of witnessing firsthand one of his clinic, which was a fantastic opportunity for me to learn, and I see observing how he deals with the clients in a really modest way, really great, same level of people, amazing. So without further ado, give Professor Anderson a big round of applause. And
Alrighty, yeah, so great to see so many familiar faces, as Amin said. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah, great. So this is going to be rather informal. I've not got PowerPoint slides or anything like that. I'm just going to sort of chat, and then when you get sick of hearing me, put up your hand and ask a question. Happy to be interrupted, so rather than just keep any questions to the end when you might have forgotten what you're going to ask, just ask me straight away, put a hand up. So that'll be informal. I guess we'll start off with the anonymous questions first, and then the less anonymous questions if you want to ask one. Yeah, as Amin said, I can't discuss individual people, so it's fine to say, oh, I've got this problem, but if you do that, and I'm happy for you to do that, but I'll just discuss it in a general way rather than saying, you should do this or do that, but I'll just say in general. It's better that way. So I'm ashamed to say this is my first time here as well, in case there's anyone else who's here for the first time. Magnificent facility, I have to say, fantastic. Yeah, great to have it in Canterbury. Yes. And yes, when you're thinking about donating to the MS and PD Society, if you're thinking about donating for research, you could also think about donating to the NZBRI where we do our Parkinson's research, but don't not donate to this organisation. We've got a fantastic facility. So should we just carry on with the questions? Yeah.
Cool, thank you, Professor Anderson. The first question came through, obviously we know there are some risk factors associated with Parkinson's. One fundamental question actually, but why did I get this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm sure it's in everyone's minds, but not always expressed when I see people. And especially when people are first diagnosed, I think that's very much in their mind. And it's a complex answer because there's a whole host of different causes, but in general, the reason why you have got Parkinson's and not your spouse or anyone else is that you have inherited, so there's basically genes and environment are the two factors that are most important here. And so the first is genetic susceptibility. And we know that there are some genes, quite rare genes, that actually cause Parkinson's. So if you inherit, these are called, and it's called monogenic causes, monogenic Parkinson's. And so there are some genes, either recessive or not, that actually cause Parkinson's. And in that case, you either inherited a gene from your mother and your father, and together the two alleles, the bit from their mother and a bit from your father, cause this recessive Parkinson's. So you might be aware there's a gene called Parkin, and these cause rare forms of Parkinson's disease, often come on younger. So these are people who develop their Parkinson's in their 20s or 30s and 40s commonly. The recessive causes, they progress very, very slowly and otherwise look like ordinary Parkinson's. But they're very rare. I would only have a couple of people in my sort of practice that would have that sort of gene. Then there are what's called the autosomal dominant genes, and there's two in particular which do not say you're going to get Parkinson's, but give a reasonable chance that you might. And that's called the GBA, glucocerebrosidase gene, and the LRRK2. So they will not inevitably cause Parkinson's. So they're very rare, much less than 5% of people will have a gene that will cause their Parkinson's. And then there's another group of people who may have what's called the LRRK2, quite rare in New Zealand, who would have inherited that gene from one of their parents, which caused that parent's Parkinson's, and then they passed on that gene to their children, and so 50% of their children will inherit that gene, and they are likely to develop Parkinson's, but not definitely. So there are some genes that will give you a moderate degree of susceptibility to getting Parkinson's. There's two of them, and the most common one of the two in New Zealand is called the GBA gene. And we know from a survey we've done here in Christchurch that about anywhere from 7 to 10% of people will have a variation on that gene. There's about 300 different mutations on the GBA gene, some of which are more what we call pathogenic, in other words, have a more likelihood of causing Parkinson's in the person that gets that gene from one of their parents, and some are much less pathogenic and have a bit of an outside chance of causing that person's Parkinson's. But we know that in the Canterbury region, about sort of 7 to 10% of people with Parkinson's will have a mutation on that gene, which has probably contributed to some extent to causing that Parkinson's. In those people, it comes on maybe a few years earlier than people who don't have that gene, and people may get cognitive problems a bit more commonly if you have that gene. And if you have that gene, then there's a 50% chance you'll pass that on to one of your children, and they may or may not get Parkinson's. But the vast majority of people with Parkinson's will have a susceptibility gene, or maybe several. So we know there are about 90 susceptibility genes floating around, we've all got many genes, thousands of genes. There are about 90 so far identified Parkinson's susceptibility genes that will not cause Parkinson's, but they'll just give an extra little bit of susceptibility compared to people who don't have that gene. And there's 90 of them, but people don't inherit all 90, but they probably inherit a few. And if we take those sort of genes, then they probably confer about a 30% to 40% sort of risk of you getting Parkinson's. So there is a genetic susceptibility that will, mean you've got more possibility of getting Parkinson's in a person than other people who don't have any of those genes. I'm not sure if you follow me so far. So people who've got Parkinson's in this room, you may or may not have inherited a number of these different susceptibility genes, which makes it just a little bit more likely than maybe your spouse who doesn't have Parkinson's for you to get Parkinson's, but it's not causing it. So there has to be then other factors on top of that little bit of genetic susceptibility that you've inherited that has triggered off the Parkinson's in you, rather than your friend or your spouse or your partner. And these are basically what we call environmental factors. And there's a few that will again contribute to getting Parkinson's. And we did a study here in Christchurch, actually published in the Top Movement Disorders Journal, where we were able to show, or we thought we could show, that you probably need about 8 different hits along the way, exposures to factors in the environment that we don't really know, that together with your genetic susceptibility has then triggered off the Parkinson's in you. And we don't really know what those environmental factors are. We think that there's about 8. If you develop your Parkinson's after the age of 50, if you develop your Parkinson's before the age of 50, maybe 6, because the younger you are, the more chance there is that you may have more of a genetic cause, or contribution, I should say. So the younger you are, the more the genetic contribution probably. The older you are, the less that there's a genetic contribution. But the factors in the environment, we're not really sure. I mean, we've recently had Bas Bloom here, and somebody would have gone to his lecture and he was touting the toxins, that we use in farming and so forth. Well, we know that's not the sole cause, because we know lots of people who've been in the rural environment, who've used sprays, have been exposed to toxins who never get Parkinson's. So you can't believe that toxins are the sole cause of someone's Parkinson's, right? It has to be exposure to maybe some of the toxins on top of your genetic susceptibility. But then there's other factors that we don't know, not just toxins. Maybe some viral influences, maybe some pollutants, who knows what. We just don't know, to be perfectly honest. So that's why whoever asked that question, got your Parkinson's, probably you had a genetic susceptibility from having a bunch of different genes, susceptibility genes. It's possible you may have the GBA mutation, of which there's 300, and possibly you have that, which made you a bit more susceptible, but none of those caused your Parkinson's. They just contributed to. Unless you're very rare, one of these rare people who have a gene, a causative gene, that caused your Parkinson's.
Fantastic.
So I don't know if that's really, if anyone's got any questions on that.
You covered really well, thank you. So, so considering this genetic risk factor, now if father or mother of the family got Parkinson's, what should they do for the children? Is there any way that they could test?
Okay, so on the same theme, the question is really to do with, well, if I've got a gene that may be contributing to my Parkinson's or causing it, one of those rare ones, what can I do, for my children? Now, see, that's a big worry for people who feel worried about passing on Parkinson's to their children. Well, as I mentioned in the previous sort of answer to the previous question, the chance of you passing on a gene that will cause Parkinson's in your children is very, very low. But you may well pass on a susceptibility from the genes that you inherited from your own parents, and then maybe your partner or spouse who's also contributed to the genes in your children may have their own susceptibility factor, even though they've not got Parkinson's themselves. We do not test the children of people with Parkinson's unless they have one of these rare monogenic causes, right? So we know there's one family who has a rare mutation in alpha-synuclein, which is the protein that is involved in causing the brain changes of Parkinson's, and we may come to that. There's one family that we're aware of in this region where two of the children inherited a gene from one of their parents, and that was the cause of their Parkinson's. So in that case, one can then test the children, but we don't test children under the age of 16 because that's not really ethical. And so there's not really much reason to test at the moment for genetic susceptibility in your children for several reasons. One is that we don't actually have a proven treatment that will slow down the course or prevent people's Parkinson's. So if and when we got a treatment that would stop the development of Parkinson's, then clearly, and it's related to some genes, then clearly it might be useful then to check the children to prevent the Parkinson's coming on in the children who've inherited that gene. But at the moment there is no need to do that. And also, as I mentioned and harped on about, it's only susceptibility factors that you inherit. It does not mean you're going to get Parkinson's. So we don't want to worry the children and yourselves about doing genetic testing when the chances of them getting Parkinson's are really only double. If we take everyone with Parkinson's, ordinary old Parkinson's, that develops at a later age, then the chances of your children getting Parkinson's are about double the rest of the population, but it's still low, right? So yes, your children might be a little bit more likely to get Parkinson's than the next, than somebody who doesn't have Parkinson's children, but it's only a small extra risk. It's double, but that risk is low still. Cool. So short answer, we don't test unless it's a known cause of Parkinson's.
Your message to the family is basically stay healthy, eat healthy, do the exercises, carry on the life.
Yeah, it's a message that we all should be, whether you've got Parkinson's or not, or Alzheimer's or not, we should all be doing the same things, which is, rigorous exercise, eating healthy, like a Mediterranean style, mind style diet, keeping socially active and keeping mentally active. We should all be doing that to keep our brains healthy, no matter whether we've got Parkinson's or not. But yeah, that's the advice to children as well. Don't start at 60 when you're saying, oh gosh, I might get dementia. You've got to tell your children, and as I do mine, actually, they don't take much notice, but they need to. You've got to start in their 20s and 30s. That's when you've got to start doing all that stuff. Right?
So everything, I'll just read the question. Everything you read on Parkinson refers to 5 stages. How do we know what the stage we are at?
Yes. So the question there is, the person has said, I've read about the 5 stages of Parkinson's. So how do you know what stage you're in? I never use word stage. So none of my letters I write to GPs after I see everyone, any person with Parkinson's, I never say, oh, I saw, Mrs. Jones who has stage 1 Parkinson's. Yeah, I don't know where they got promulgated. We don't use the word stage, or I certainly don't, because everyone's Parkinson's is different. So everybody in this room who does have Parkinson's has got your own and not one else's. And, we don't talk of stages. The Parkinson's in every individual progresses at a different rate, in a different way, with different symptoms and different responses to medication. And some people's progress more slowly, some faster, some respond better or not to certain medications. And for example, young people who develop their Parkinson's in their 40s or 50s, and there are a number of those, generally progress at a slower rate with their Parkinson's symptoms than people who develop their Parkinson's when they're 80. And so, it's silly to talk about stages because many of those younger people won't get some of the complications, such as hallucinations or loss of balance, or even dementia, until much, much later, years and years, decades down the track. Whereas somebody develops Parkinson's in their 80s is perhaps a little more susceptible to get those problems earlier. So it doesn't make sense to talk about stages. People progress a bit in certain ways with certain symptoms, then they might have a bit of a dip, and then maybe plateau a bit. So I don't talk in stages.
So the scale that the Huntington scale that neurologists would use called the UPDRS.
Yes. So Mint mentioned something called the Huntington scale, The Huntington scale is a very old one that doesn't put people in stages as such, but characterises the severity, mainly depending on whether Parkinson's is just on one side or not, and you're probably aware of yourselves especially, but this is true in almost all cases. The Parkinson's starts on one side. Could be left, could be right, but it starts on one side, and we don't have any idea why that is. It's peculiar. In a condition that is what we call neurodegenerative, why would it start on one side of the brain? We don't know. And so Huntington scale talks about, okay, if it's just on one side, then it's maybe stage 1, and then if it goes to the other side, maybe stage 2, and then if you've got some balance issues, we call it stage 3 and so forth. So that does talk about stages in the Huntington, but we don't use it. I never use it in the clinic. It's sometimes used in trials, not so much these days. The UPDRS that Min mentions is a slightly better way of scoring the level of your Parkinson's, not the stage, but just how is your Parkinson's exhibiting itself right now, what's your status, and that measures a lot of different things, motor status and non-motor symptoms, and we put that together on about a 138-point scale, and you can score X number of points. But that doesn't tell you what stage you're at, it just tells you these are the problems that you suffering from, or that you're exhibiting at any one point. And by and large, as time goes on, depending on whether you're responding well to treatment or not, your score will go up as things progress, and you'll all be aware of progression of symptoms in yourselves, except you can start treatment and you actually get better with symptomatic treatment. So we use these scores, not so much in the clinics, because for me to say, oh, you've got a score of 60, it ain't going to mean much to you, and it doesn't mean much to me. But if you say, oh, look, I'm having trouble with my balance and I need to do this, that's much more meaningful. So the number that you've put to your status is meaningless, unless you're wanting to do a drug trial or some form of trial, non-pharmacological or pharmacological, where you want to measure a response to treatment. And you might know that I feel better or not, but to prove it and to be objective, we need to do a score, and we need to score what your status is. And so you need to do these scales, and a lot of other more sensitive measures these days for drug trials to show whether there's been improvement or not. But in a general clinical sense, when I see people 6 months after the last time I saw them, I'm not putting a score on you. I'm just saying, right, what's your main problem at the moment, and let's address that. Right?
Yes. Well, thank you. We know it is a degenerative condition, but if the symptoms of Parkinson remains mild after 4 years post-diagnosis, is it likely they will remain the same in the long term?
Right, it's a good question. So this person is asking, okay, if I've just got very mild symptoms and I've been having my Parkinson symptoms for quite a number of years, does that mean I'm going to do really well in the long term, compared to if I was, going down the gurgler quickly in a few years and developing, quite a lot of symptoms early on? That's yes and no. I mean, if you look back how you've gone over the previous X number of years since you first developed symptoms, and you an imaginary sort of tracking that line, then yes, if you're a very slow progression of your Parkinson's, then yes, it's likely to carry on in a sort of similar vein. And so we know that there's a minority of people who have quite a progressive, more rapid course of their Parkinson's symptoms, a minority that is. And people are nowadays trying to work out early on, what is the cause of that person's faster progression compared to the majority who don't progress that rapidly. And we know that younger people progress, as I mentioned before, progress more slowly in the main than older onset people. It's a slower progression in younger people, partly because there's genetic contribution in some of those. So now to come back to the question, which was,
so is it going to remain for the the long term?
Oh yes, yeah. So can you work out how you're going to go after the first 4 years or 5 years or 2 years? Sort of, but there's a huge variation, right? So you can't say, oh, because I've got my symptoms, I've done not so well in the 2 or 3 years. that's me sort of progressing more rapidly. Not necessarily, it will depend a lot on your response to treatment and so forth. So, and different symptoms pop up, and some don't progress very much, others progress more. So you can't really be accurate in your sort of projection forwards, but generally, if things have gone slowly for you over the first few years, then there's more chance of going more slowly than more rapidly. But it's a generalisation.
Cool, thank you. Next question comes to, for those who are recently diagnosed, is there any advantage in starting their medication early?
Yeah.
It's really hard to get neurologist appointment, as you know, to confirm the diagnosis, and GPs wouldn't
yeah, no, that's a
put
very
them on their medication.
very good question. It's been a question that's been sort of asked over the years, and if you asked me that question maybe 15 years ago or thereabouts, the general philosophy, the general policy from neurologists and others, it was to, don't start treatment until you really need to. So, let's delay starting you on treatment until it's causing you disability or, a problem in your life. And that was prevailing opinion then, partly based on the fact that we know there are side effects from medication, and you'll be aware of that. Partly based on the fact that, that levodopa is associated with development of dyskinesia sometime down the track. And so that was the prevailing opinion. And also there was a feeling back then that maybe levodopa is actually causing some damage to the brain, even though it's treating symptoms well, maybe it's also a little bit toxic. That was the thoughts way back then. But that's all been proven to not be true. So the first thing is that levodopa does not do any harm to the brain at all. And so some of the GPs out there, and maybe some physicians, still have this idea that, okay, no need to start treatment until it's really starting to bother you. But then it depends what bothers you, right? And it's amazing how people can be stoic and just, because, this comes on gradually, almost imperceptibly, so that often it's the family that notices the Parkinson's before the person themselves. Often people just adapt to their changed circumstances. I'm just getting older, and that's why I can't get off the chair so well, and my walking slowed down. And so people sort of, they tend to sort of minimise their symptoms quite often. And that then translates to the GP or the neurologist to say, in that case, let's just wait until you really get bothered by it. But the reality is that by the time most people present, they do have symptoms that will interfere with some aspects of your life, and there's no treatment actually does any damage. It doesn't hasten the condition or anything. There's theoretical evidence that treating early may be better for you in the long run. Theoretical evidence, not proven. So my general philosophy these days is that you start treatment early. If the person has virtually minimal symptoms, then I might say, let's just wait for a year or two. But by and large, if you've got symptoms that cause any sort of issue, it doesn't have to be a debilitating issue, then I would say, yes, I would start treatment. But yeah, it's out in GP land, some GPs, the older ones especially, would be a bit hesitant about that. And so you're right, you've asked that question. Yeah.
And all the GPs can prescribe the medication?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, they can. Yeah, so any GP can prescribe the usual drugs that we use in Parkinson's. Some don't like to. They prefer to wait for a specialist opinion. Some people like to get in and they congratulate themselves on making a diagnosis of Parkinson's. They're pretty excited and they want to start the treatment.
Yes. You kind of covered that second question, because what is causing dyskinesia?
Right.
That excessive movement, obviously.
Yeah.
And what is the situation that can make it worse? Is there anything can help lessen the dyskinesia?
Right, yeah, thanks. So dyskinesia, as I mentioned just now, for some people it's a scary thing. And the trouble is, you go on the internet, you see the words dyskinesia, it sounds like something really bad, you don't want to get it, therefore you don't want to get started on medication, then you don't want to take too much and so forth, which is fine, but since I was a house surgeon, it's clear that dyskinesia is not such a big issue as it used to be then, mainly because of the way we use our medications a bit more wisely now, and we know more things about it. So people who've been on a dopaminergic drug for their Parkinson's, the main one being levodopa, cinnamate, but also the dopamine agonists, propinerol and pramipexole, or even the monoamine oxidase inhibitors, like misageline. All those medications can potentially ultimately contribute to people getting dyskinesia some years down the track, but especially levodopa. That's the main one in causing dyskinesia. So dyskinesia, for those who don't know, most of you will know, is excessive involuntary movements, which is not tremor, but the opposite. It's extra movements we call chorea and sometimes dystonia. And it's a result of the medication, but there's different forms of dyskinesia, and I'll come back to that. By and large, the dyskinesia, well, if you look at the figures, and everyone's different, about sort of 40% of people after 7 years will have some form of dyskinesia after treatment. But it's very dependent on how long the person's had their Parkinson's. In other words, the duration from the start to when, to where they're at in their Parkinson's, the dose of the levodopa, so how long the Parkinson's has been there, and how big a dose is the person taking. They're the two main determinants to getting dyskinesia. And also the age. So younger people are more prone to getting dyskinesia earlier than older people, and slightly more in women than men. So younger women are more prone in general terms than older men, for example, but younger people are more prone to getting dyskinesia earlier than people who get their Parkinson's much later. But no one's immune from getting dyskinesia. People worry too much about dyskinesia. I'm always having to say, look, don't worry too much about it. We can usually handle it and deal with it. And some of the more modern treatments which may come to can actually stop dyskinesia or certainly reduce it if it's a problem. There's different forms of dyskinesia, as some of you might be aware. So the most common and the earliest. So what happens when you start people on treatment, and again, many of you will be aware of this, is that it's great for quite a few years often. You can even take it 1 dose a day and you'll be fine, although we tend to give it 3 times a day. And then after a period of time, because the nerve cells that are producing the dopamine in your brain, they're taking up the levodopa and converting it into dopamine and then releasing it to the next nerve cell on the pathway. And so that's relieving people of their symptoms. So once you develop your Parkinson's, you've probably lost about 50% of those dopamine-producing neurons in a certain part of the brain, called the novostriatal pathway. But the 50% that are left, they take up the cudgels, and like factory workers and work longer hours and harder, and they produce more dopamine until you get to the point where they can't produce enough, and then you get your symptoms. So it's been coming on over years, then you get the symptoms. Then we give the levodopa, and that works well, but as you lose a few more nerve cells in that pathway, the factory inside the cells that are left, which maybe 30% by now, can't keep up with the demand, and the half-life, the duration of how that long your dose lasts, your levodopa dose, your cinnamate lasts, gets shorter and shorter, and so the half-life of levodopa, cinnamate in the body is about 90 minutes. So you take a dose, it's gone down to half the level in the blood and the brain in about 90 minutes. But the duration of benefit that you will get, especially for the first quite a few years, is much longer. It's called the biological half-life. Anyway, as time goes on, the duration of benefit you get from that levodopa dose starts to approximate the half-life, the biological half-life, which is 90 minutes. But it doesn't get to that short for many people. But it means that people end up taking a few more doses per day than what they started with. And you'll be aware of that, many of you. Now I'm trying to remember the question again.
Good question. Was that dyskinesia? Is there any medication?
Yeah, dyskinesia. Yeah. So, so someone comes along with dyskinesia. There's different types. Thank you. That's obviously. So the first thing that crops up after the medication wears off, but no dyskinesia, is a bit of dyskinesia, and that's called peak dose dyskinesia. So people will notice that maybe an hour after they take the dose, maybe a bit longer, start to get a few little extra movements called chorea. And that's the most common and the least troublesome for people. Many people are not even aware of the dyskinesia, right? So it's often the spouse or the partner who says, oh gosh, you're jiggling around, the person who's got it, and it doesn't really bother them, right? Because they're fairly switched on. Usually when the people got peak dose dyskinesia, it's switched on, the mobile, and everything's working well. And so it's not bothersome to that person. Then there are other forms of dyskinesia which can be a bit more troublesome for people. Another form is called wearing off dystonia. So there are some people in whom you take the dose, you may get a bit of peak dose dyskinesia, mobile stuff like this. As the medication wears, as the levodopa levels fall in the blood and then therefore in the brain, levels fall to the point where the person is switching off. But not only do they switch off, but they start to get some twisting, rather contorting movements, which are more troublesome and can be a bit painful. That's called wearing off dystonia, or off-period dystonia. Some people might experience that first thing in the morning after they wake up because it's been a long time since the previous dose the night before. The levels of levodopa have dropped to the level, but not only switching off, but actually getting this wearing off dystonia. And the treatment for that is to increase the dose, or to take a dose in the middle of the night, or take a rapid Matapart tablet first thing when you wake. For the peak dose dyskinesia, that's sort of not too troublesome, but extra sort of mobile movements or head nodding. The way to treat that is to either reduce the dose of the levels of each dose, right, but take the dose more often, so that the levels of the levodopa in the blood and therefore the brain are not quite as high at their peak. So you just take, you sort of top it up, if you like, by taking extra doses but a lower dose. If you get this wearing off problem, then we just need to increase the medication. Right? So there's different ways of handling the dyskinesia depending what the nature of it is. So my job, and particularly your job, is to work out what's happening to you at what time after the dose. Right? So if you're saying, I take my dose every 4 hours, and at 3.5 hour level, I just sort of switch off, I can't move so much, and then I get this sort of twisting or sort of contortion that's uncomfortable. That's wearing off dystonia, and we need to increase the dose of the previous dose, or bring that dose, the next dose forward. If you've got peak dose dyskinesia, then we're going to perhaps reduce the dose of the levodopa, but give it a bit more often. So it depends on what the nature of dyskinesia is. Why people get dyskinesia is still a vexed question. It's very complicated. It's just giving pulses of levodopa, they're sort of industrial doses really for the brain, because all of us who don't have Parkinson's at least are releasing little pockets of dopamine as we need it on a sort of second by second basis. And if we need a bit more, we release a bit more. If we don't need it, so it varies through the day. And even if you've got Parkinson's, that's still happening. But we're giving you this sort of industrial doses of sort of levodopa, pulsatile every now and then, 3 times a day, 4 times a day. And that seems to have some consequences on the dopamine receptors that makes them more susceptible for you getting the dyskinesia. And so one of the ways of reducing that dyskinesia in the sort of medium to longer term is to have more sustained, even levels of levodopa in the blood and therefore in the brain, which is not so easy to achieve just with oral tablets or oral medication. And so we know that with more advanced treatments like apomorphine infusions, apomorphine is a bit like a dopamine agonist was. Dopamine agonist that you infuse under the skin with a pump, and you have even levels throughout the day and sometimes the night, and that in the longer term reduces dyskinesia. Some people have deep brain stimulation, maybe 1 or 2 here have that, I'm not sure. Deep brain stimulation will stop dyskinesia pretty well. And so there are ways of stopping dyskinesia or preventing it. A more simple way, in which many of you may be on, is a tablet called amantadine. Amantadine is an old-fashioned drug for Parkinson's, it's been around for decades, and it's got multiple sort of actions that can improve people's Parkinson's symptoms a bit, sometimes called side effects, but also it can reduce dyskinesia. So our main use of amantadine these days is to reduce dyskinesia. It can do it quite successfully. So you shouldn't be frightened of dyskinesia, we can deal with it pretty well. We just have to sort out what sort you've got with the help of you, describing your symptoms, or even taking videos. because we only see you in a snapshot of time, you know, you've got your Parkinson's all day, so sometimes helpful to have a video. If you've got a movement which you're not quite sure about, you're not sure it's tremor or whether it's dyskinesia, well, it's important for us to know. So, you know, sometimes a video is quite helpful, actually. Yeah, we can, but the overall message is if we can treat dyskinesia pretty well, by and large, don't be too scared about it. In the end, if you start on a non-levodopa medication like ropinirole, pramipexole, then your dyskinesia is delayed compared to when you start on levodopa. But most people can't exist solely on pramipexole or ropinirole for many years at all. And so in the end, we add levodopa, and in the end, if you follow people over many, many years, the proportion of people who have dyskinesia is about the same, as depending, doesn't matter whether they start on the dopamine agonist, like ropinirole, pramipexole, or levodopa, such as matapara. In the end, it's pretty much the same. But our strategy, by and large, is to keep the levodopa levels as low as is comfortable for people. And so for me, if the person's not got other sort of sensitivities, I would, you know, if I get to a level of levodopa, assuming a matapara that's more than 600 milligrams a day, or looking like it's needed, I would try and add a dopamine agonist at that point, just to reduce the chances of dyskinesia. But don't be fine with dyskinesia, we can usually deal with it pretty well.
Great, thank you for the explanation. Next one is about lack of energy in Parkinson's. So the person who just diagnosed in 2022, reasonably busy, so sleeping really about 8 to 9 hours a night, very good. So every 3 to 4 weeks, he says, I'm having a crash that I lose my energy and I need to sleep for 2 to 2.5 hours. Am I doing well? Am I pushing the limits of Parkinson? Was it normal?
Yeah, good question. It's about fatigue. And look, you know, all of us get fatigue from time to time, and some of us do. You know, I crash every now and then, and so, you know, so fatigue is universal in Parkinson's. It's common in the general population, and when we're looking at fatigue as an issue in Parkinson's, first of all, you have to look at, is it what we call primary or secondary? So by secondary, we mean the fatigue is due to another type of symptom. For example, if someone's become apathetic, and that can happen in Parkinson's, apathy can be associated with fatigue. So if you're apathetic, can't be bothered, lose motivation, which can come with Parkinson's in some people, then that will also be expressed as fatigue as well. And so if we concentrate on the apathy, and sometimes it means increasing the levodopa, that can sometimes improve the fatigue. If the person's become depressed, and maybe it's not recognised, it is also associated with a sense of fatigue. And so there are some causes of fatigue that can be addressed in other ways. The fatigue is secondary to something else. You know, if we exercise too much, all of us, you know, and we run a marathon, our muscles get fatigued, and so we do feel fatigue, but that's called physiological fatigue, and that's obviously easily dealt with. But in neurodegenerative disorders, like Parkinson's, people can experience what's called central fatigue. It's not due to the muscles, you know, being overused or anything like that. It's part of the brain process, and you know, sleep doesn't necessarily cure it, as some of you will be aware. Perhaps if you've suffered from a lot of fatigue, you know, it's a process that's happening in the Parkinson's brain, and it's been speculated as to what that might be. It might be inflammation and all sorts of different reasons why that person might suffer from fatigue, central fatigue. We don't know a lot about it in terms of how to treat it, but by and large, and there's lots of different drug trials, and they're all showing maybe promise, maybe not, and there's no one drug that's going to help that. Sometimes amantadine can be helpful for fatigue. It isn't in multiple sclerosis, for example, but not quite so proven in Parkinson's. But exercise, building up stamina, is probably the best way that you might try and approach that. So that's building up stamina, and we've got someone here who can help you do that. And that's what I would generally say to people: if you're getting fatigue, on a day-by-day basis, then try and build up some stamina and exercise and so forth. Not easy for people who can't do a lot of vigorous exercise, because you may have balance issues, you may be in a wheelchair or whatever. So it's easy for me to say, but you can do some form of exercise, and so building up stamina is probably the best way to try and cope with fatigue until we find better ways of treating it. Why the particular person who asked the question crashes, I don't really know. You know, Parkinson's can fluctuate from day to day, within the day, and you know, a lot of my patients will say, "Oh, I had a really bad day, you know, yesterday or last week. I just had a day when I couldn't do anything," and it happens, and I don't know the answer to that, but you know, you're allowed to have variations in your sort of general energy levels, whether you've got Parkinson's or not, you know, biorhythms and so forth.
Since they mentioned the word crashing, is there any chance you could elaborate on a sleep attack? So
Yeah.
that,
Okay, yeah, thanks. Yeah. So sleep attacks, actually not a word that we tend to use so much these days, but it became very much the vogue when there's a whole lot of new dopamine agonists, propranolol, pramipexole, and some of the others are now sort of got extinct. And so the dopamine agonists, those medications are more likely to cause side effects of sleepiness than levodopa or some of the other medications that we use. So, you know, we usually warn people who are going to start on pramipexole or propranolol, the dopamine agonist, that it can cause sleepiness. And in some people, a minority, it can actually cause sudden onset of falling asleep. So over a meal, boom, you know, falling asleep. It came to prominence maybe, again, 15, 20 years ago, when some of the new dopamine agonists were being launched. That some people were in car accidents, some people died because they had fallen asleep at the wheel, which is a real concern, of course, because you kill yourself or someone else. And so they were called sleep attacks. Sudden onset of sleep with no warning. I mean, all of us when we're driving, you listen, some of us, well, I do, might start to feel a bit sleepy, you think, oh, and you might have a little thing, oh, I better pull over, or perhaps I'll keep going, which is not the right idea. So we're all, you know, we can all have little lapses, but sleep attacks are when the person just has no warning, just falls asleep due to their dopamine agonist medication. Sometimes on levodopa, but more likely the propranolol or pramipexole. And when, in those days, back 15, 20 years ago, we had to warn people that they had to stop driving when they started on dopamine agonists. This came out of the UK especially, which was hopeless. You know, people said, "Oh, I'm not going to stop driving." But we don't say that now, but we do warn people that you could feel sleepy with medication, and if you start having sleep attacks, you must not drive. Yeah, that's what. Yeah, so that some onset of sleep.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Next question. There are some trials happening, as you know, around the world using other medication as a disease-modifying treatment for Parkinson's, namely the medication for type 2 diabetes, exenatide, has some promising result in the UK in phase 1 and phase 2, I think, in 2012 it started.
Exenatide.
Yes. So how does it go with phase 3 that was recently?
Right.
And if that's any positive result, is there any chance it comes and available in New Zealand?
Right, okay, good question. So some of you may have heard about exenatide. It's one of these GLP-1. Thank you. And you've heard them in the news recently for weight loss. You know, people are taking these medications to lose weight, and that if they've got diabetes, then that will often, you know, drop their glucose levels to non-diabetic levels, and so it's a great drug for people with diabetes. But there's a link that you may or may not know between diabetes and Parkinson's, and it seems that Parkinson's is more common in diabetics than non-diabetics. It's not, you know, inevitable by any means, stretch of the imagination, but there is a link, and there's pathophysiology in the brain that accounts for that. And so that got people thinking that maybe medications that increase insulin, such as these medications like exenatide, may slow down the course of people's Parkinson's. And the phase 1, as you mentioned, and the phase 2 trials of this medication that took part in the UK initially and then in Europe, seem to show promise in that the phase 2, so I don't know if you know about trials, but phase 1 is when you try the medication, usually initially in university students, and if you kill them off, then the drug's obviously no good. But if they survive that and there seems not too many side effects, you'll then use it in the population you want to basically target, which in this case is Parkinson's. And you'll do a phase 1 trial where you'll just find the right dose for people with Parkinson's that doesn't cause side effects and seem to be, you know, what you think is going to be effective. And if that's past that stage, you think, oh, this might be a goer if you're a drug company and want to make millions. and you do spend millions to make millions. And then you go into phase 2, which means you have it's a placebo-controlled trial then, so some people on the dummy, but they don't know it, and some people on the real stuff, usually 1-to-1. You know, half the people get the real stuff, half the dummy, and you might have something like 70 people on each side, which is regarded as a small trial. But that's done to check, okay, if you put it against placebo, does it look like it's going to be better than placebo, the dummy stuff, without too many side effects? And if it's looking likely, then you go on to a much bigger trial. So exenatide, the one we just mentioned, it passed the phase 1, passed the phase 2, and it looked like it was helping to slow down the course of people's Parkinson's. Not by a lot. So on the UPOS scale that we just mentioned, 138 points, in the phase 2 trials, the people who are on the real stuff, the exenatide, they just stayed much the same over the sort of year or 2 that they were on it. And the people who got the dummy stuff dropped about 3 or 4 points. So, and that was statistically significant, but clinically not a huge difference, but anything that slows down the course of Parkinson's is really obviously going to be really good. And so it looked very promising, and so it went into phase 3, as someone who asked the question is aware of. The results have just been announced to the participants in that trial last month, and it was negative. Sad. Everyone was hoping that it was going to show it because it looked promising, but this is why you have to do big, large-scale phase 3 trials where you've got hundreds of people enrolled with the Parkinson's, and some getting the dummy, some getting the real stuff. And sadly, it didn't show any benefit on anything that was measured. So that particular drug is obviously going to fall by the wayside, but there are other drugs in that same category that have been tried. One was published, another phase 2 trial published by French investigators, got another name, which I wrote it down, you'll remember it. Isnatide. It was a trial in France, phase 2, which was positive, a bit like the phase 2 had been for exenatide in the UK. And it showed something similar. No progression of people's symptoms over time. We took the real stuff and compared to people who progressed somewhat by quite a few points who were on the placebo. So that will go into phase 3. And there's another drug yet called
Parkinson's in particular.
Yeah, there's no trial that's proven that it's useful. That's the short answer to that. It doesn't have a role to play from the published, from the proper trials, and there not be many proper trials, don't have to say, but what's been looked at hasn't shown any benefit. There's individuals who anecdotally say that their tremor can be better, but yeah, I wouldn't put your hand in your pocket too much to spend too much money on that. I mean, you could try it if you wish, and if you feel better on it, then fine, because it won't do you too much harm, depending whether you take the CBD or the CBD plus THC. CBD has no psychoactive effects, but it does work on the cannabis receptors. THC has psychic effects, that's why people smoke it and things for recreation, and can make people feel better while they're having it, but in terms of Parkinson's symptoms, not as good as established drugs that have been tried in clinical trials. I don't recommend it, but I don't say you mustn't have it.
You kind of covered the next question. Is there any new research on medication on the trial in New Zealand, which can be promising?
Right. Yeah, so there's 2 parts to that question. Is there any new research on medication? Yes, there's about 136 trials going on as we speak around the world, trying by symptomatic treatments. By that we mean treating symptoms, not the cause. And there's a lot of those, including a new dopamine agonist, D1, D5 dopamine agonist, which looks promising, and quite a number of other medications designed to improve people's symptoms, and all sorts, and particularly in the last few currently ongoing trials to look at non-motor symptoms. By that we mean hallucinations, cognitive impairment, orthostatic hypotension, all those things that come with Parkinson's are not just purely the motor or the movement type problems. So there's a lot of those going on as we speak. Quite a few, some of those are phase 1, some phase 2, and a smaller number phase 3, because a lot of, because the expense of this, as I mentioned, costs millions and sometimes billions to do these trials, you know, they fall out as you go through the phases, phase 1, phase 2, and so much less, there are fewer in phase 3 than at any one time than there are in phase 1 and 2. But there's still quite a number of phase 3 trials for non-motor symptoms, as well as for disease-modifying treatment. By disease-modifying treatment, DMT, if you read it, that's trying to slow down the course of people's Parkinson's, to act at the disease level to try and reduce the speed of progression in people. And there's quite a lot of those in various sort of forms. Some stem cell, which are, by the way, stem cells, do not go for stem cell treatment, taking fat out of your body and putting it into your vein, because those never form dopamine producing neurons. So it's stem cell treatment of Parkinson's aimed at increasing dopamine producing neurons in the brain, and that's very specific, and it's got to be done in a trial situation, and is being done around the world. Japanese are at the forefront, but it's by no means ready for use at the moment outside of the trial. But the specific question about New Zealand, and actually I was just saying to our study coordinator today, it's been disappointing the last couple of years. There's been no new trials of Parkinson's offered to us in New Zealand, whereas it used to be pretty common. And some of you here have actually participated in those trials. But nothing's come to us the last couple of years, and not much to Australia, a little bit to Australia, but not much. So it's been disappointing, and I'm not sure why, but it seems to be more in Europe and China and so forth. But I'm sure they will come.
Is there any role at all for keto diets in the treatment of neurodegenerative disorders like Parkinson's?
Yeah, that's a good question. If you talk to your colleague in Hamilton, Matt Phillips, he's a sort of the person who's sort of leading the charge in New Zealand. He will say yes, because he did a trial that seemed to show benefit. Unfortunately, it hasn't really been, well, there's been one or two other follow-up trials elsewhere which haven't really shown the same sort of benefit. So at the moment, I would say there's not proven. There's still some trials, studies going on, but at the moment, not proven. Yeah.
Great.
There was something else I was going to say. Oh yeah. So you may have heard of phospholevodopa. Has anyone heard of that? Have you heard of phospholevodopa? No. Phospholevodopa, it's called phospholevodopa phoscarbidopa. That is a new form of levodopa. It's a pro-drug, so it's a sort of pre-levodopa drug. And that has been tried as an infusion that you, a bit like apomorphine, even that it's infused under the skin with a wee pump, with a needle under the skin, and you infuse it, constantly through the day and through the night. It's a form of levodopa that you can infuse under the skin, and so you get constant levels. And the idea of that, of course, is to make the people switched on the whole time and reduce the levels of dyskinesia. It's been used in people with more advanced Parkinson's successfully, and it's available in Australia and in other parts of the world, Japan and the States. You can just, it's licensed and it's marketed, and you can pay for it and you can use it in those countries, or what the state may in Australia. Not available in New Zealand. So it's successful in reducing, and keeping people switched on. But it's, there's nodules and things. There are some complications from the needle and the infusion under the skin, and it's expensive, about $68,000 a year in the States. So you can expect it's not going to be funded very easily here in New Zealand just yet, but it may well be coming. But it possibly no better. Well, it's about the same efficacy as the levodopa gel, which we don't have here either. We have a tube into the stomach, or the duodenum actually, and it contains levodopa, and you can just feed the small intestine with levodopa via the gel, and that's expensive too, $50,000 a year, but we don't have it here. But that's just something that might be coming. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. How do cognitive and physical symptoms relate to one another?
Yeah, another good question. So, if you've got, a lot of motor issues, does that mean you're going to have at the same time a lot of cognitive issues or other non-motor symptoms? The short answer is they're not particularly related. I mean, overall, if you've got severe motor impairment, then you perhaps are a little more likely to have more cognitive impairment, especially if you're older and you've had your Parkinson's for some time. But we see people who have who have, you know, quite a lot of motor issues but have no cognitive issues at all. So they're not necessarily related. We see some people with Parkinson's who unfortunately develop their cognitive issues quite early on. And there's a condition called dementia with Lewy bodies, which you may have heard. It's sort of related to Parkinson's, there's debate about it, where people actually present with cognitive issues with not much in the way of motor issues, and then their cognition continues to get worse towards dementia. And that's a different sort of condition called dementia with Lewy bodies related to Parkinson's. So those people have much more cognitive problems than they do motor. So there's no direct relationship, to be frank.
Just going back to that medication, is there any chance that New Zealand will have the rotigotine, that patch?
Rotigotine, yeah. There's always a chance, and I hope it comes. Many years ago, I'm not sure there's anyone here who would have been on that patch. We did a trial of the patch, rotigotine patch, in Christchurch and somewhere else in New Zealand, maybe 20 years ago. And I've got 1 or 2 people still using it. And it was very effective. About 10% of people can't wear it because of a skin reaction. But it basically is a patch put on once a day, and it provides this dopamine agonist, like Rapinol or pramipexole, slightly different, but it's a dopamine agonist like that. So most people can't just stay on it, you know, as sole treatment. But it gives constant levels of this dopamine agonist over 24 hours. It's good at people who wake up in the morning, they can't move. It's very good at treating that particular symptom. It's not necessarily better than those Rapinol or pramipexole, but it's certainly easier to use for some people, and it's only once a day. I think they've tried to get the marketers, the drug company have tried to get it funded here, but it failed because Pharmac in those days were saying, well, we've already got some good dopamine agonists like Rapinol and pramipexole, and your drug's more expensive, therefore we're not going to fund it. But I'm sure it will be at some point. Because we would want it, because people have operations and they can't take a lot of medications easily, you just put on a patch. So it would be good, so you could agitate for it. You can buy it from Australia. I think 1 or 2 people have reported it to try it, but yeah.
Fantastic. And my last question, here, and we can open it to the floor. We all hear that exercise works as a medicine, especially for Parkinson. In what extent do you believe on that? And do you think other GPs, neurologists encourage people enough to exercise?
Oh, so exercise?
Exercise, yes.
I think the answer is no, people don't get encouraged enough to exercise. I try to encourage people. It's taken some years, a long time to prove that exercise is helpful. People have been telling, people with Parkinson's have been telling us for some time, but it's not been easy to prove in trials, partly because it's hard to have a placebo. So, if you take a new drug trial, you've got one pill that, it looks like the other, but one's placebo, one's the real stuff, and you can't tell the difference by looking at it. But to do a proper trial of exercise, it's pretty obvious, if you're on the placebo tends to be routine sort of daily stuff that you might be doing on a daily basis, like walking and so forth, against the prescribed exercise program that's the active. And so it's not been easy to sort of do that for physios and exercise physiologists and so forth. But finally, there's mainly coming out of Finland, but elsewhere, there's good proof now that exercise is critically important, as most of you know. It's got to be tailored to something that you enjoy doing. So there's no point every day just getting up and oh God, I've got to go and do this whatever it is that you hate, and then you won't do it. You've got to be something you enjoy. But really, I'm talking to the converter. It's really important. So I do encourage people to exercise. Perhaps I should encourage it more. And certainly GPs and so forth are so busy, 10 minutes. They're too busy concentrating on other things and just don't encourage it enough, I would imagine. But I think societies now, the lay societies and so forth, are really pushing it and educating people. So critically important. So whatever exercise you can do, you should do, and as much and get the heart pumping as much as you can.
That's great, fantastic. Just remember that we're not discussing any individual points, and now open to the floor. If you have any question, if I can bring the mic to you. Yeah.
What's the line of how do we get that medication into New Zealand from the producers? Like I find differences between from one batch to levodopa to the next. And I'm just wondering, is there any, what do you call it, control over the medication when it comes into New Zealand?
So you're wondering how do we get better access to newer medication?
Not so much, no, not newer medication. The same pill, but I find that they're different. They're not always the same.
Right. So yeah, there has been changes. Let's take levodopa for example. So some of you might remember it went through Syndopa, was a form of levodopa, carbidopa, and Cinemet couldn't be got for a while, and then Cinemet CR, the control release ran out, and so there have been problems with supply at various times, especially over COVID actually, but before and since. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, and it's a pharmac issue, and the trouble is, New Zealand's such a small country, big pharma, we don't really make much profit for them. We're not a big market, and so they don't really take us into consideration, compared to bigger countries. And so we're at the mercy of some of the big pharma companies. If they don't if they can't get in, if they don't bring into the country reliably, then we're a bit at their mercy. Pharmac has got a bit of part to play with that, and they sometimes haven't negotiated fully. And at times when they were driving hard bargains, the pharmaceutical companies were saying, "Oh well, if you're trying to push the price down and down and down, we're not so interested." It's probably better now. But yeah, I don't have it because I'm not involved there, so I don't know.
Oh, I just thought you might have an idea how it works.
Oh, it works something like that, I think. It's all to do with negotiations that we're not privy to because it's all commercially secret, and we never hear about it.
Okay. I have one more little question. I'm on the maximum amount of medication, and I'm trying to find a balance of whether to take it more often or whether to take it over a longer period. What's your advice?
Yeah, when it comes back to when I was talking about the dyskinesia and so forth, and in general terms, there's no maximum, right? So you can't say, I'm now taking 2 grams, 2,000 milligrams of levodopa, I've hit the maximum, I can't go any higher. There's no maximum. It's really the dose in any person is limited by what you need to switch you on and stay on, and what are the side effects, and have I developed too many side effects from the dose I'm taking. And so the dose is limited by the side effects solely, generally, and so there's no maximum. You can't say, oh right, you can't take it, unlike other drugs where there is a designated maximum, you can't take more than 100 milligrams or something. But in Parkinson's, there's no limit, there's no maximum limit of the levodopa. It's limited by the side effects that person will have. And so, I have people taking 2,000 milligrams, even 3,000 milligrams a day without any dyskinesia. And I have other people taking, 300 milligrams a day, 100 milligrams 3 times a day who get dyskinesia. So it's all individual. You've got your own Parkinson's and no one else's, and everyone's different. So there's no maximum, and it's a matter of trying to work out for each individual person. Yeah, sure, maybe you take it a little less more often, or maybe we switch you to something else, or maybe you take one of the advanced treatments like apomorphine infusion for people who wear. So people who find that if they take more levodopa, they start to get too much dyskinesia, then they get wearing off as well. Then we might encourage people to try the apomorphine pump, where you're smoothing out fluctuations. And for younger people, people 70 or less, by and large, there's deep brain stimulation, which isn't any better than what you get in your best response to levodopa, but it smooths things out and reduces dyskinesia. So, it varies with each individual person. But there are ways. There's never nothing you can do. Right? Never ever. Don't let anyone tell you there's nothing you can do. Right? That never happens.
It's just
It should never happen.
the nurse keeps on telling me, I'm sorry, we can't do anything more for you.
Well, you shouldn't have anyone telling you that.
Okay, I'll tell her next time.
And certainly don't let me tell you that. There's always something to do.
Any other question? Oh, you can go.
I should repeat it. I can repeat it.
Thank you. I just wondered how much evidence there is about having protein close to or far apart from?
Yes, yeah, that's a really good question. So if you didn't hear it, what about protein and meals and, in relation to taking meals and protein to when you take your medication, you levodopa? I've got a couple of minutes to explain. So, we know that levodopa, some metal matter part, gets taken in, it's got to get through the stomach, it's not absorbed from the stomach. It's got to get through the stomach into the small bowel, which is called the duodenum and jejunum. So that's the first thing to recognise, that you do not absorb levodopa through your stomach, it comes from the small bowel, so you've got to get it through the stomach. And that varies from day to day as to, it's called gastric emptying, when you empty stuff from the stomach into the next bit of the bowel. And that, if you have a full meal, then that might delay the emptying into the small bowel. Levodopa itself can change the emptying process into the small bowel. Parkinson's effect is that by itself, and so there's a few variations there. But that's not the question. The question is, once it gets into the small bowel, and it has to come into the bloodstream from the bowel. And that process is what we call an active process. It's got to have a sort of a courier, a transporter, is to take it from the blood from the small bowel into the blood. So imagine, a courier just taking it, you'll put a levodopa and transport it across this barrier called, the gut into the bloodstream. And that's a process which it's called active. It needs a transporter. And the trouble is, some of the proteins, not all of them, some of the amino acids, the proteins in the food can compete to get onto that courier and stop the, and get there ahead of the levodopa and get into the bloodstream the proteins, and that means the levodopa doesn't get absorbed as well. And so sometimes in some people, the protein and certain types of protein in the food can delay or prevent that levodopa that you've just had, sodium metabolite, getting into the bloodstream. Not usually prevent, but delay. And the same thing happens actually in the brain. It's got the same transport system. So for some people with brittle control, who maybe have had their Parkinson's for some time, where by brittle control I mean that a lot of fluctuations, wearing off, dyskinesia, that sort of situation we just heard about. For some of those people, they have to make sure they don't take their levodopa with the meal, at the time of the meal, if it's got protein in it, or high levels of protein, because that can delay. But that's a minority of people. And the opposite, I have quite a number of patients, when they first start levodopa, feel nauseated, because that's one of the side effects. And actually, those people, if they have something to eat at the same time, the nausea is much better, but they still get switched on, because they're earlier on their Parkinson's and they don't need much to switch on. So it depends on the person as to whether it's important. But in essence, if you look at the drug insert on your Matapara or some method will say, take at least half an hour before or an hour after meals. But you don't necessarily have to do that. For a majority of people, it doesn't really matter too much. But for some people, it does. So if you're one of these people that knows that if you have a meal, you switch off or it makes a big difference, then you're the sort of person that should take it, either side of a meal, not within them. But that's the reason why there's competition between the proteins that you have, certain types, and the levodopa to get into the bloodstream. There's a fight.
So what are those proteins?
What are those proteins? Not fully, but there's amino acids basically. You've got proteins, there's a whole lot of amino acids in the protein that we eat. Some seem to be more important than others. You ask me which ones, I don't really know. And no one really quite knows, but they've got certain, some people sort of know to some extent. But it's not every single protein, but it still hasn't been worked out yet. So by and large, if you're one of those people, you just avoid proteins, which is generally meat in particular. So some people who have this issue, they just delay their protein to a meal at night, right? They just have all their protein at night. They say, oh, well, I'm going to switch off a bit, but I'm going to, I can sit and watch TV and they're going to go to bed, so it doesn't matter. But they don't have protein for breakfast or lunch because they want to be active and doing stuff.
Next question.
There are some problems towards when muscles don't work as they should for swallowing, and therefore sometimes susceptibility to aspirational pneumonia. Is there something you can do to strengthen throat muscles and swallowing that helps prevent choking, for example?
Right, yeah, good question. So this is the issue of swallowing and Parkinson's, which can come on not at the beginning and sometimes never, but for some people it can be an issue. It's not due to weakness of the muscles, it's due to incoordination, which is a problem in Parkinson's anyway, as people know. You lose some of the coordination that you used to have. The same is true for the muscles of swallowing. When we don't have Parkinson's and our swallowing is normal, there's an orderly contraction of the muscles in the gullet that takes place that just brings the food down at the pace you want to and doesn't let it go into the lungs and so forth. So the problem with the swallowing issues in some people with Parkinson's is that coordination is lost. And so those muscles just don't work in the sequence and order that they should. They're not weak, so there's no point doing strengthening exercises because they're not weak. They're just not coordinating properly. And so if I get a person who's got issues with swallowing, I don't know much about it, to be honest, because I send off to the speech language therapists who do the swallowing assessments and so forth. Having said that, you'll be amazed at the number of people, not necessarily just with Parkinson's, but other neurological problems. I see a lot of people with Huntington's, where swallowing can be an issue. And that see speech therapists, they have a terrible looking video swallow. You think, oh my God, you've got to go into soft. But actually, you don't want to have a soft diet because it's a dreadful condition. And I think I enjoy eating, it's my one pleasure in life. I want to keep eating. And you'd be amazed how people manage to stave off any problems with aspiration pneumonia and so forth. But you're right, and some people with Parkinson's and who have a lot of motor issues, sometimes the swallowing can be a major issue as well. But very rarely to the point you need to put a peg or any tube in there. Most people can cope with some change in diet and proper instruction on how to eat with it. There's methodologies to try and improve that speech therapists know the tricks on. They're the people that help, just like speech therapists help the voice and not the medications.
Any other question? No?
No question. It's a good question.
Correct. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Professor Anderson. I think we all enjoy and we learn a lot. Here we'll just ask you maybe next year and promise us to come again.
Yeah, sure. No, of course, I'd love to. Yeah. And thanks everyone. A lot of friendly faces there. I know, and thanks for listening to me.
That's great.
Very good questions, by the way.
And there's no gift from